culture and hope of Tasmania's First Peoples. Libraries Tasmania also pays respects to the resilience and strength of the Tasmanian Aboriginal people and extends that respect to all First Australian peoples. So my name is Alicia Marchant, or Ali, and I'm an archivist here in the State Library and Archive Service within Libraries Tasmania. Recently, my colleague Bev Warrett, who's who is a family historian and library technician here, have been working on a really interesting project that celebrates the 150 years of the Tasmanian Railways. What we'd like to do here today is to explore some of the wonderful railway records in the Tasmanian Archive collections. So I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes or so and then answer any questions that you have. We have on display in the Colonial Room, which is actually just off the back there, some fabulous original railway records for you to have a look at, and we'll invite you to come through there in the second half of this talk. We also have images of some in frames dotted around the room here in this space. You may have noticed also there's a railway film we had on in the Allport Gallery as you walked through. And lastly, we'd really love to invite you upstairs also at the conclusion of this to have a look in the reading room. We've got some secondary resources out there for you on the tables. We can answer questions as we go as well, and also to have a look at our display up in the reading room there too. Adults and children alike, there are few people who do not love trains and railways. Railways mean a great deal to so many people. There is just something so majestic and awesome about trains, and particularly steam trains. The noise of the whistle, the smell of the burning coal, and the sound of the train slowly gathering speed and thundering down the track. It's truly a wonder. For some, it is the memory of riding on a train as a child, or perhaps visiting or playing on the Margate train. Day trips to wilderness areas, adventures, picnics, and travel to new places around the state. Perhaps some of you here today are here because you are drawn to the more technical side of the railways, the engines and the carriages, and how they work and fit together. The nuts and bolts, the stunning feats of engineering of the bridges, the apt track design for steep gradients of track, or perhaps the unique architectural grandeur of some of our train stations. There is a lot to love about trains. For 150 years, Tasmanian Railways have captured our imagination and have played an important role in the economic and social history of Tasmania. The story of the Tasmanian Railways is one of great successes, but also of hardships, economic failures and disasters. It is a colourful and dynamic history. The first stretch of railway in Tasmania was officially opened on Friday the 10th of February 1871 to great celebration, but also great relief. It had been a difficult and expensive task many years in the making. The Launceston and Western Railway Company ran from Launceston to Deloraine and was constructed to aid in the timely delivery of produce from the rich agricultural lands of Perth and Longford and surrounds to the ports, then for export over to the mainland. In the years that followed, train lines were developed around Tasmania. The Mersey and Deloraine Tramway Company was formed in 1864, and I hope that it's clear because I made this map myself. It's not very good, but this is this actually section here is the Mersey and Deloraine Tramway. You can see it's not very big. This here is the Launceston and Western Railway, and then this one here is the Mainline Railway, which I'll get to in just a second. So the Mersey and Deloraine Tramway Company was formed in 1864 to link Deloraine with the northwest coast, using a line with a 4-foot 6-inch gauge. This company found itself in serious financial difficulties when it opened in 1872, and it had only 27.9 kilometres of track, which was not used as much as expected. And as a result, only after 4 months of operation, the company was forced to retire its only engine. After this, the line was worked by horses between Latrobe and Rolton for seasonal produce. The Mainline Railway, which ran from Hobart to Western Junction, where it joined with the Launceston and Western Railway, too was developed. Construction began simultaneously in the northern and southern ends of the Mainline Railway in 1873 and was completed by November 1876. Now, each of these 3 railways were developed by private companies, although the Tasmanian state government was involved to varying degrees in providing financial support. As a result, each of these 3 railways were constructed with a different gauge. For instance, the Mersey and Deloraine Tramway Company was constructed with a 4-foot 6-inch gauge. However, it was eventually taken over by the state government in 1885, and the track was then replaced with a 3-foot 6-inch gauge. Now, the history of the Tasmanian Railways is incredibly complex, and this is an extremely potted history of the early development of railway in Tasmania. Railways came to operate over much of the state where there were population centres, but also were developed to support mining and timber industries. Further branch lines off main lines were developed. For instance, the Mainland Railway that ran from Hobart to Launceston had several branch lines. For instance, there were branches that ran to Oatlands, and there were also lines that went to Kempton. Now, to celebrate the 150 years of Tasmanian Railway, Libraries Tasmania have on display at several libraries around the state currently copies of images that reflect the rich railway history of the particular region of that library. So, for instance, in the Burnie Library, currently on display, we have images that all relate to the Emu Bay Railway and the Western Line, that beautiful track, that beautiful railway that hugs the coastline of northern Tasmania. Currently on display in the Rosny Library are items to do with the Bellerive to Sorell train line, which I'll speak more about in a moment. Some lovely images there. And I borrowed back some of the images from Hobart Lending, and there are 2 in the white frames that are just to the side of you there, which I encourage you to have a look at. Now, each of you will soon, or perhaps already do, have a postcard. We've got some at the front, and we'll hand these out to you. But what we have done in addition to these displays at libraries is to have these postcards, and on the back you can actually, it's got a QR code which you can scan, and that will take us directly to a Flickr album. The Flickr album contains all of the images that have gone around the state. A really lovely collection. Now, these photographs are just a handful of the incredible collection of Tasmanian Railway records that are held by the Tasmanian Archives and the State Library of Tasmania. The Tasmanian Archives literally holds tens of thousands of records on the railways in Tasmania. And the history of how these records came to be in the Tasmanian Archives is as interesting as the records themselves. There have been several stages. Firstly, the 3 railway companies that I mentioned a moment ago, the Launceston and Western Railway Company, the Mersey and Deloraine Tramway Company, and the Mainline Railway, all found themselves in serious financial difficulty and were eventually absorbed into the Tasmanian Government Railways. Just as a very quick sideline, mostly because I love this image and I wanted to work it in, at Longford, the bridge across the South Esk River actually cost £30,000, which was a truly huge sum of money and really contributed to the railways not making any money at all. So as state government interest increased over the whole railway network, the Tasmanian Government Railways was established under a General Manager for Railways in 1888. Now, the ways in which the records in our archive collection are named and organised reflect this history. Some records were produced by the private company and then passed on to state ownership. So, for instance, the Launceston and Western Railway Company had its own Tasmanian Archive series, which you can see up the top. It's written there. Sorry, this is just a snippet of our website. Is NG, the number is NG 3081. Now that NG refers to non-government, so it's a non-government record, and that has its own series. But then when the Launceston and Western Railway Company changed to being the Launceston and Western Railway Department, which was more state-owned, that's a separate one here, and that actually has a TA number, which is for Tasmanian Agency, which means that it's actually a state record now. So the naming of these records actually reflect the ways in which the history of the railways, the particular railways, evolved into being the Tasmanian government railways. And you can actually see the beauty of the way in which our records are arranged is that it has subsequent and past agencies. So you can see that the company was the first record, and then it moved on to the department, and then the subsequent one is the Tasmanian Government Railways, which is the next evolvement of that particular record series and agency. Now, the second stage in our records, in our railway records, came in 1978, when the responsibility for railways passed from the state government to the Commonwealth Government. And a significant portion of the records that we have in our collection came to us directly from the National Archives, because ownership of the Tasmanian Railways from 1978 to 1997 transferred to the federal government. Now, in the 1990s, the National Archive essentially rescued a large collection of railway plans that had been kept in less than ideal storage at the Inveresk Rail Yards in Launceston. Many of the records had been damaged by the 1929 floods in Launceston and were actually incredibly dirty. They were covered in soot from steam engines. It was a great irony, and needed to be cleaned. So these were essentially rescued and now are part of our collection, and some of them are in the room next door, and you can have a look at these records, the P series. So to give you a little bit of an overview of the sorts of records that are in the Tasmanian Archive collection of railway records, this includes civil records, which includes tracks, lines and crossings, buildings such as stations, yards, roundhouses, bridges, and land surveys. And in many instances, like this is the plan for the Launceston station. In many instances, the plans and the drawings are magnificent works of art in themselves. They're truly beautiful. And in fact, when you go through to the colonial room, we've got they're actually technical drawings, and they're just absolutely stunning pieces of art in themselves. So the next sort of series are mechanical. This involves mechanical drawings of various scales of steam engines, diesel engines, carriages, rolling stock, and all of their components. And again, we have some on display for you next door. The staff records or employee records, I think, are the most exciting amongst all of the records, and we'll explain, I'll go over some of these in a moment, because particularly for family history, these records are absolute gems to uncover little snippets of information about people. So the staff records, and then we've got a really lovely film, and it's actually available on our YouTube channel, which you can...
For real travel comfort, travel by the Tasman Limited. Modern fast diesel service running daily between Hobart, Launceston and Wynyard. Relax in air-cushioned seats with head and armrests while you travel through Tasmania. You can have rugs for winter travel. Newspapers and magazines are handed to passengers. Sweets, cordials and cigarettes are brought to your seat by the train assistant. And what is better for the children than to be able to move around a little instead of being confined to their seats?
Have a look at, those of you who are aware, many of our films you can watch anytime. It's available on our YouTube channel. The Libraries Tasmania have our own channel, and then there's many more railway films there, which I encourage you to have a look at because they're really lovely. So, another series of records that we have on railways are administrative records. These include things like asset management, correspondent registers and indexes. Now this image here is of an M class. It's actually the M4. The M class is actually my favourite class of train, which is quite amusing because 6 months ago I don't think you would have heard me say that I had a favourite sort of train. But it's amazing how wonderful these projects are and how much we've learnt. But anyway, this is the M4. So this is actually the record of, what is it? It's the locomotive record, and it's a bit of a service record and gives you an overview of each train. These are actually gold if you want to research a particular sort of locomotive, or a locomotive, in this instance the M4. So you can see that the here it says that the M4, I can't actually read it from my angle, but that it actually first came into service in 1952. And one of the images that's behind Bev there is actually the M series came by boat from England, and we have lovely images of these trains coming off the boat onto the Hobart Wharf and being lifted by crane and slowly descending, and that's one of the images there. So that's one of these. This particular train came off the boat in that way there. And the Margate train too is actually the M class series, which came off that boat as well. So it's really lovely history, that sort of train history just keeps going, all these tangents. You sort of unfold something and you realise that you know the Margate train really well because your children play on it, or and there's a picture of one of that same class there. So another sort of record that we have are maps and plans. Maps show the evolving impact of railways on the landscape and the emergence of towns around stations. Sometimes it can show the loss of land by family, because often, and I'll talk about this more in a moment, but often the plans will have particular families' land grants and their land written on the plans, and then a train line going straight through it. So the maps and plans are really interesting, particularly for family history. Now, this is a very brief glance to give you an insight into the enormity of the railway records that Tasmanian Archives holds. And to help you navigate these records, we've created a brand new Guides to Records. There are paper copies of this Guide to Records up the front, and it of course is available on the Libraries Tasmania website under the Guides to Records. So what I have here is just an overview of all of the Guides to Records. And the one that you want is the Tasmanian Railways one, and that's just a copy of it there. And it lists all of these series that I had in the PowerPoint, so there's no need for you to urgently write everything down, because they're also in the Guides to Records there for you. So then, how do railway records fit within the context of family history? Well, I've been thinking a bit about this. And family history, I think, is all about researching and finding connections to people and to places. It's about exploring the lives of family members who lived before you and finding out about their life experiences, the major events in their lives, where they lived, where they worked, their neighbours, and their connections to various communities. Railways, then, may have played a key role in the lives of some of the people who you were researching. It is possible that you had a grandmother or a brother who worked for the railways at some point. And in this instance, railway records, like employment records, may be really critical to your research. However, it may be that you are interested in researching railway records because you or a family member once lived in a town where there was a railway station and that was the centre of town life. Perhaps your family ran a railway motel or hotel, as there's one in Longford, for instance, or there used to be one in Longford. So the various railway hotels, and you want to research more about the connection between that hotel and the railway itself. Or perhaps it is just that you have fond memories of riding on a train as a child and you want to know more about this particular line that you travelled on. Well, you've certainly come to the right place here. At the State Library, we have a range of resources to help you research trains and family histories. And if you're able to come upstairs into the reading room after this talk, we have gathered some of the secondary sources together for you to have a look at. Now, it's important to bear in mind that the histories and records of Tasmanian railways intersect with many other areas of research and records too, such as local histories, town planning records, migrant files, public works department records, war effort records, housing and architecture. And I'll explore some of these in just a moment. However, before I do, I just wanted to highlight the people element underlying some of the very technical train drawings. As many of you who are currently doing your family history are well aware, there are many, many tangents and avenues that suddenly appear for you to explore that you never even knew existed. And a very good example of this was recently explored by our colleague here, Jess Walters, who wrote a blog for the Tasmanian Archive and Heritage blog, a piece called Hidden Figures, Tom Midwood Caricatures and the Tasmanian Railway Records. And I'd really encourage you to jump on the website. All of the social media for Libraries Tasmania is located at the bottom right of the Libraries Tasmania webpage, and you can click on anything there, and the blog is certainly one you can subscribe to. You can subscribe to it there. Now I'll leave you to read Jess's blog, but starting with what she does in this blog is she starts with a really interesting plan from the P1330 series, and she explores the life of the draftsman who actually did the work in this particular plan, Tom Midwood. Now Tom was obviously a bit of a cheeky character and placed people's faces in some of the little trees and things in the diagrams. So it's a really lovely example that reminds us to think about the people who created these railway records as well, those who designed the train stations or surveyed the land. Because it's quite easy to forget that the people or group of people who were involved in producing these really technical drawings and plans, you can actually find out about them as well. So, in other words, just to use a fairly fun example, I would encourage you to think about the people who designed this chair, which is a chair for, I actually don't even know what class it is, but it's a chair. So think about the people who designed the chair for the bottom of the guard who sat upon it. So to think about the person who designed the chair, but also the guard who sat upon this particular chair. And hilariously, what I've really come to learn about trains is that everything is meticulously detailed and measured even down to the guard's chair. Now, railway records can be absolute gold for family history research because the railways were such an important employee in Tasmania, providing numerous avenues for employment. The sorts of jobs involved could be in the day-to-day operations of trains, making sure that trains were safe and on time. This includes the positions such as crew, drivers, station masters, shunters, watchmen and signalmen. If it was a passenger train, then this could also involve cleaners and the staff to provide food and drink services. Jobs also revolved around the maintenance and upkeep of the trains and rolling stock, ensuring safety and efficiency, repairs, boilermakers, engineers, mechanics, and as the train network also developed, people were employed in the construction of new tracks, new stations and infrastructure like bridges, as well as their design. Now, railways generate a huge amount of administration and business affairs were generated in huge amounts. And that required the employment of accountants, clerks and stenographers. If there was one thing I've learnt about the history of railways is that the administrators were meticulous in their record keeping. On display in the Colonial Room we have a diary of the engineer for railways from 1929 for the Mount Lyell Mining and Railway Company, and it just shows this amazing meticulous attention to detail, that there's something about the weather and then there's accidents that are noted, and it's just incredible the amount of administration that was generated. Now, the two main series of records for the Tasmanian Government Railways is TC1 and TC10. And as I keep saying, these are gold mines of information. Unfortunately, these two series are located these series of records are all individually listed within our catalogue, which means that you can locate an individual by searching in the library catalogue using the name of the individual who you are searching for, but by using the Tasmanian Archives tab. So I'm sure that you're aware that there are different tabs that are on the Tasmanian search engine. It's the Tasmanian Archives one that you want, not the names index, which is somewhere there. Sorry, my angle is a bit funny. So if you click on that and then put the name of the person in who you are after, then with a bit of luck you might get a railway record come up. So using the individual name. Now with this TC1, so this is the TC1 series here, there are 6,230 files within this series, covering the years from 1939 to 1996. These are staff files for people who worked for the Transport Commission, which is what the TC stands for, is the Transport Commission for the railway branch. And doesn't include people who work for private companies like Emu Bay Railway Company. Now this image that I have on your right hand side there is basically a snippet of the first 15 of these TC1 files. And as you can see, there are staff members named, and it can also provide information about their role, their position, and the dates that they worked. So you can see Arthur Wills, Assistant Secretary there. So these are really, really useful series for researching people. Now I randomly selected a pile from amongst these over 6,000 files, and we have it on display in the next room. So I chose someone called Kevin Mills, who was a blacksmith for the Transport Commission from about 1956 to 1967 in Launceston. Now the sorts of information in his file include various letters about his position, applications for leave, and in this instance I've taken a copy of this one. There's an accident report, so the poor thing, he actually, a hot coal flew up and he received an eye injury. So this sort of thing is actually really interesting, providing small snippets into someone's working life which we wouldn't otherwise already have. The second really useful record series is TC10. TC10, there are 23,037 records in this series, and they cover the years from 1890 to 1963. And again, we have a couple of examples for you in the Colonial Gallery to have a look at. Now these are employment records. They're essentially letters of correspondence. They might include discussion of such topics as employment conditions, union matters and policy. Some files are not specifically about the individual, but are about particular train stations or branch lines or something really general. So you can see in this selection here, there's one on the Campania disaster up the top. And hilariously, there's also one on brass checks for luggage. She is somewhere up there, I think. I can't see. So these more general records can be very useful. For instance, if you were researching the Fingal station because you knew that one of your ancestors worked at the Fingal station, then over 100 different hits come up in this particular series, just using that keyword Fingal. So these are records that you might like to explore and see if your ancestor is named in them, as well as finding an individual file. So the sorts of information contained in the TC10 files include local station business, administrative matters, maintenance issues, operational issues, interactions with business and industries and other government departments, land acquisition, regional railway stations, water supply. So a really detailed lot of information is contained within some of these files. And again, you can search for particular topics that you're interested in. Now, women had several avenues for employment opportunities in the railways, including such positions as stenographer, so shorthand, station caretakers, typists, clerks, key punch operator, and key punch supervisor. And during the Second World War, women were able to step into jobs that were once offered to men. Now, this is something that I'd really like to research further. I'd like to know more about the role that women had in the railways in Tasmania during the Second World War. I would like to know, I would question things like, were they able to take on more traditional role of drivers or boilermakers? And I haven't really, in the research I have found, I haven't really found much discussion of it. So if anybody has any thoughts on this matter, it's something that I'd particularly like to know more about. the more that I have been exploring these TC1 and TC10 files, I've come to realise what a treasure trove of information they really are. They offer lovely snippets of information. For instance, Margaret Minnie, who I randomly chose amongst the TC10 files, had 6 years' experience as a typist sonographer and actually lists the places that she worked. So this is absolute gold. And when I was researching the role of women in the Tasmanian Railways, I found that in 1944 there was an investigation into the employment of women and their working conditions, and this included the Tasmanian Railways. So in The Examiner in February 1944, a newspaper article states that Nancy Thompson, booking clerk, said she had entered the service 4.5 months ago with no previous experience. She and another girl were doing the job previously filled by one male. Her rate of pay was £172 a year and the male rate was £249 per year. So essentially Nancy had little work to do, obviously. Her and her colleague had to share the work of one person, but was also seriously underpaid, the poor thing. No wonder there was an investigation. Now Nancy continues on in this news article saying that Hobart, there was no changing accommodation and no meal room. The women had their meals on the platform and changed in the car if there was one available. There was no provision for hot water, nor was adequate wearing apparel provided. They were asking for overalls, cap, gloves, boots or shoes and soap and towel. At Launceston, amenities were entirely absent. Now, this really illustrates how wonderful newspapers are in backing up and supporting some of the things that you're interested in researching. And I went on a tangent with this because I absolutely loved it. And excitedly found that we have Nancy Thompson, poor Nancy Thompson's employment record held with us in TC10. So that's it there, and we have it next door there for you. Now in Nancy's staff file is a letter of application for her employment, and Nancy very clearly states in her letter that she already had a connection to the Tasmanian Railways, that her father, she states, the late Robert Thompson, was yard foreman in Launceston. So we also have Robert's employment record too, so that's just it in the library catalogue. Now you can see how these tangents emerge and completely take over your research in many wonderful ways. But it's a really good illustration of how you can really unpack something, and if you have an ancestor that worked in the railways, then this is certainly something that you can do. So the Inveresk Rail Workshop and the Launceston rail yards that Robert Thompson, that his daughter said that he had worked in, that particular rail yard was really extensive. And it's one of many rail yards and workshops that were around in Tasmania that sort of provided support and mechanical what do you call it? Sorry, I'm just going to get a drink actually. That service the trains is what I was trying to say. So in the early 1870s, the Inveresk Railway Workshop, where Robert Thompson worked, opened to support the Launceston and Western Railway Company. Now, this workshop was a very small venture to begin with an engine shed and blacksmiths, but this grew to be a really significant place of work, employing over 1,000 people in the 1940s. From 1950, the workshop at Inveresk increasingly came to specialise in servicing and constructing diesel engines, which had started to replace the steam engines. So one of the pictures that I've showed you earlier, which is currently on display at Burnie, this diesel hydraulic 10 class number 1004, which ran on the Emu Bay Railway, was built in 1966 at Launceston at that government railways at the Launceston workshop. So you can see how you can sort of start really unpacking and following these tangents to the point of connecting them up to trains. And this particular train ended up in New South Wales. It still operates on something called the Zigzag Railway. So the TC10 files, we have TC10 files on specific rail yards and workshops, like the major hubs at Hobart and at Inveresk and Launceston, which I've just spoken about. Now down here in Hobart, I'm sure that many of you are aware that the ABC building was the old train station, and that in and around Macquarie Point industrial area, the rail yards consisted of numerous sheds and workshops, including a roundhouse, of which we have a beautiful plan of in our collection. Some of you might remember the roundhouse. I think it may have come down in about the 1970s. Now, these records that I have discussed with you are really the core of the railway records. However, as I mentioned, railway records intersect with numerous other series and research areas within the context of family histories. I will just briefly mention some of the other useful avenues for you to pursue. So if your family history involves people who came to Tasmania as migrants, perhaps from Eastern Europe or Italy, avoiding war or after the war, then it is possible that they may have found employment on the railways. Our records show that the Transport Commission, Railway Branch, actively sought out skilled migrants for employment, as did some of the private companies, such as the Mount Lyell Mining and Railway Company, from which this record is from. That is an application for employment for migrants. Now, there is a TC10 file on migrants, which we have next door for you, entitled List of Migrant Workers and Locations, Equipment and Provisions. And I've scanned a page of this for you, which clearly states the names of several migrants and the placements and where they were placed. So you can see the names and then where they were placed. And there's further discussion there of other migrants and jobs that they were going to try to provide for them. Now, what I decided to do on one of my tangents is to have a look to see whether we have a TC10 file for any of these individuals, and I found all of them. So I had a look for the first person on the list up here. So for Milekek, and we have this is his record here. So they're all connected. Well, you can explore the many different layers within this. So the Tasmanian Archive holds many migrant records, such as the series AA59, and we have a guide to records on arrivals, immigration and departures, which you might find interesting if migrants form part of your family history research. Now, unfortunately, none of the names that were on that migrant TC10 list are actually within the migrant files, which means that they probably weren't nominated to come out and that they came out. But National Archives would most certainly have records of any arrivals. Now, mining and mining records too can be very important. Mining was responsible for a tremendous amount of railway infrastructure around Tasmania. Railways such as the Mount Lyell Railway, Mining and Railway Company, and the Emu Vale Railway and its extending branches were built to support mining operations. The Mount Lyell Mining and Railway Company was prominent in building railway infrastructure, including the Apt Railway and the North Mount Lyell line. In 1897, the Apt Railway from Queenstown to Tipukana was opened, and by 1899, this line had been extended to Strahan. The Apt track and pinion system was used to assist the locomotive up and down the very steepest sections of track. The Tasmanian Archives holds a great many records on the Mount Lyell Mining and Railway Company and on their mining operations too, and these records can be really instructive for your family history research. There were many smaller mining ventures around Tasmania that also built tramways and lines to aid in transportation. Closer to home, you may have walked or cycled the Coota Tramway or Sandfly Tramway track near Margate. In 1905, construction began on the Sandfly Tramway, a 20-kilometre tramway that linked the coal mine, which is up this end, to the Northwest Bay, which is down here. So 2 Krauss locomotives ran along this narrow gauge tramway. By 1910, the colliery had ceased operation and the tramway was used to transport timber and other commodities such as fruit along this track. And up the front is this one here. That one right here, immediately next to me. This is actually a picture of some of the miners that were at the colliery at Sandfly and who would have gone up and down or perhaps even operated that train. Tram lines were built to support the timber industry down in the Huon Valley also, and also in the forests around Orford. So I have no idea how to say this, Waialangta tramway covered 6.5 kilometres from the forest to the sawmill and then onto the coast where the timber was loaded into ships. And this particular tramway operated from 1911 to around 1924. Now, the Tasmanian Archives holds records about the licensing of this mill and also the establishment of the settlement that was around where the mill was, including a school. So if perhaps your family had involvement in that, then those particular records would be very useful for you. Now, without a doubt, railways had a significant impact on the development of places around Tasmania, on urban centres, as well as agricultural lands and forest landscapes. And you will find traces of railway history all over Tasmania. And also we have a legacy in the railways have a legacy in the ways in which towns were designed or the names of streets. So what we have here is the Bellerive to Sorell railway line, which operated from 1892 to 1926 and covered a distance of 24 kilometres. At the western end, the railway line started on a jetty at Kangaroo Bay in Bellerive and then wove its way to Sorell through a 162-metre tunnel at Mount Rumney, which we have a picture of here, and over a wooden bridge at Pittwater to Sharp Point, and this is the wooden bridge here and the cut there at Sharp Point. Now, the tunnel is currently being used to grow mushrooms, and I think half of it is still owned by UTAS as well, and they've always, in the 1950s anyway, they were testing cosmic rays in there after the train stopped operating. Now, two D+ class tank engines produced by Dodds & Co in the United Kingdom ran up and down this track. The reason I'm telling you this is because at Sorell these days, the railway history is still visible. So you can find Station Street, so the train station itself, I'm not sure if you're aware, but the station is just located, it's currently an antique shop, so the building itself is still in existence, and the station is on Station Street, which is here, and that's where the station is. And then we have Dodds & Co Drive. So that particular road was named after that class of engine that ran up and down the track, which I thought was really interesting. I had no idea about that. Now, as I mentioned, the station, of which we have a picture of down here, and this is one of the Dodds & Co trains. The station here was designed, was sort of an off-the-shelf sort of design. In other words, it could actually be replicated in other places. And for those of you who would like to come upstairs later on, in the reading room, we have a little model of this particular sort of train station upstairs for you to see in 3D. Now, we have a Guides to Records currently, which we've recently updated by my lovely colleague Greta, on where someone lived in Tasmania. And this guide is really valuable in researching places, towns, finding out people's addresses and how towns and places really were situated with people. So maps and plans more generally are really important for family history as they tell the story of the impact or the proposed impact of the railway on the land. And here we have a plan of the mainline rail through Glenorchy. I've sort of blown it up here, so it's the same one, and that's the full version of it, and that's a closer one. So you can see really the impact of the railways on people. Some people may have had their land split in two or lost their land altogether. But really interestingly, from our perspective, is that many of the plans, like that Margate plan that I showed of the tramway, have people's properties listed on it with names. So it's really valuable. So here we have Dickinson Brothers, whose land is plotted on there. So in many ways then these are really valuable tools for researching your family history. Now on the flip side of this, when the mainline railway did not pass through a town, so for instance the town of Longford, as it was planned in the 1870s, the town of Longford, the people of Longford I should say, were really quite upset that the mainline railway didn't pass through their town. It ended up, because the bridge was so expensive, the railway people weren't going to do that again, so they diverted it away from Longford and ended up going to Western Junction instead and not through Longford. But the people of Longford were really annoyed about this because they were so sure that the rail was going to pass through the town and provide a station in the middle of town rather than where it was before this. The Western, Launceston, the Western station was actually on the periphery, it was on the border, and they were hoping that the station would actually come in, it would bring people, day trippers in from Launceston to their lovely town, and the hotels were all competing for people to, they were hoping to compete for people to come into their station, and to their hotels I should say, and have a fun time. So unfortunately Longford did not end up with a train station in the middle, it ended up more than 2 kilometres away from the centre of town. But you can see that this was the proposed line. The black line is where it ended up going, and it would have come through in Longford. But you can see there, the reason I'm showing you this is the number of people and families that have been plotted on this map. So these plans are really, really important. Now I've been talking for quite a while, so just to conclude then, how we can help you. And arguably this is actually one of the most important pieces of information. So the State Library and Archives Service offers a range of research services. As I've mentioned throughout, there are guides to records, the ones which I think you'll find really valuable on top of the Tasmanian Railway ones are land grants, we've got migrants, child migrants as well. There are lots and lots of guides which can help you. If you live in Hobart, then feel free to come up into the reading room and talk to our lovely staff who can help you with a range of questions there. We also have a chat service. So this is actually just our Libraries Tasmania Need Help Ask Us page. And I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but we have an online chat service which we can answer your questions directly. But if your question requires a bit more research, then we have a form that you can fill in, which is just here on the website, and you can fill in a really easy online form and ask us any of your questions. So I'm going to stop speaking now and maybe ask if anybody had any particular questions that they would like to ask. Yes, there are quite a few questions, actually. That's good. Shall I let you mediate, or
no? Just no. We'll go here and then go to the back. So,
and Bev, did you want to come up too, just in case there are any questions for either of us?
Yeah. Might need the whole of our staff.
It's a big collection.
Would you like to go first? Lady here and there. Yes.
I was just wondering, do you have any records at all of passenger numbers from town to town?
Oh,
It's a good question.
yes, I think that we do, because they were so meticulous in their record keeping with the particular lines. There are journals and also stations recorded this sort of information. So yes, we can find that sort of information out for sure.
I'd be interested to know how to find out at one time.
Sure, yeah. No, that'd be really interesting. Yeah.
So, just along that same line, I don't suppose there's any chance you have passenger names, like even things like season tickets or something like that?
I must admit I haven't seen any passengers listed, but it's possible, yeah. I think that there may be, particularly in the little journals and things like that, that there is possible, yes, but I haven't seen it. It's definitely something to explore for sure.
And there used to be lots of trains in playgrounds in little towns, and on the way to New Norfolk. And I don't know, there was one at Hill Street, I think. And I think over time they've been removed. Restored. Could they restored, or they just, how are they, where would you find where they've gone to?
Yes, so there are a number of websites because people who love trains are really meticulous in finding this sort of information out. So you can find online, there's Tasmanian Railways, I think .com.au is one, but also the administrative records that I showed at the start, if there was a particular train that you were interested in, it actually shows the history of it. So, sorry to make everyone feel a bit unwell doing this, but this one here. So this, if you knew that it was a big M class because it still had its numbers on the front, which it does down at Margate, although it was changed to an MA series, then this particular record actually says to us here that it was sold to the Van Diemen's Railway Company for £2,500. So what we can actually do with these records then is trace where these particular trains ended up. The Transport Museum also is a really, really good source of information. They're really the experts on each one of these trains and how they're restored. So this particular train, the M4, I'm fairly sure is still actively running on the Don Railway. I think, yeah, it's so there are ways to find out the history of individual ones, and with something like a train park, there's probably a record too at the particular local councils as well. So there would be some sort of receipt of its buying of this particular train. So from both ends really, the receiving of the train, but also the selling of the train by the Tasmanian Railway companies.
It was a pity because it was a visible evidence that the trains had been used in Tasmania, and I think they removed some of them because of liability and accidents.
Yeah.
Shame.
Yeah, I think that they do decompose and they become quite dangerous, and I think, yeah. Anyone really?
You mentioned start finals in TC10
Yes.
from 1890. I had an ancestor who, in his obituary in 1895, said he was appointed as a messenger to the Launceston and Westbury was it?
Western.
Railway.
Okay.
Does that ring any bells, the type of a messenger?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what that role would be, but possibly just with the administration of the actual railway itself, that it was a way of getting messages between stations or to people. There may well be records of this in the Launceston and Western Railway Company records, which would be really interesting to find out, and possibly even named.
That was the NG 3081, wasn't it? It said when he died in 1985, it said he died almost at work, a few weeks previously been at work.
Yeah, right.
So he might be in the 1890.
Yeah,
records.
look, it is possible that he may have been in that crossover where he may have actually had a Tasmanian government record as well. So it'd be definitely worth having a look online and seeing if his name appears. But if not, then the other option is really to research those, have a look at those Launceston and Western Railway. If you knew that he was based at a particular station, or if he was at Launceston itself or something like that, then there might be particular logbooks or something that you can have a look at, which would be really interesting.
He was the Launceston because he had a railway house in Citrine.
Oh yes, that's actually the plan for the, oh gosh.
So there were railway
One on
houses
top.
along there apparently, is that right?
Yes, that's right, yeah.
Yeah.
So the rail yards were right on the water there, on the Esk, but they were really prone to flooding, so they tried to move, yes they did, they moved the station, and this was the proposed station at the very top there on that street. So yeah, that whole area there was sort of in industry and to do with railways and steel, yeah. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Are there any employee records for the very early days from, say, 1875 onwards?
Yeah, so there aren't individual staff or employment files, but there would be records of things held within the particular government, like the particular company records. So it would be worthwhile definitely having a look if you knew that someone worked for a particular tramway, then having a look at those records and just seeing for those particular dates and seeing if there was something there. Unfortunately, yeah, the government really were the ones to have that individual record in a way in which the other previous companies really didn't.
I do have a copy of an advertisement that was in London papers advertising for, I think they called it navvies, to build the railways, and that was about 1871 or 72, and my great-grandparents came as a result of that, but I don't know where they worked, other than the fact they had 10 children and they were born all around the state, so I presume that might correlate with, you know, different companies or whatever.
Yes,
definitely.
Yeah, for sure. It would definitely be worth having a look at those records and seeing if there's anything listed, any names there. Yes.
Does the library have the EBR records?
EBR.
Emu Bay Railway.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yes, we do. I'm so sorry. I had to think there. Yes, and they're listed on our guide.
Right.
Sorry, I had a mental blank there. We do. So the Emu Bay Railway, we have records from 1880 to right up to 1998 for them. I haven't really worked on that series much, so I'm not quite sure what is actually in that series itself, whether there are employment records, but I know that it's quite a large collection of things that we have.
Thank you. And the second question was the Zian Strawn Government Railway. Have records for that? Are they part of Tasrail records?
Well, I'm not really 100% sure about that. I think that they probably are. I don't think that they're going to be anything to do with the Mount Lyell collection. But I think that's something that we might have to explore a bit further because I'm not quite sure about that, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's probably a good ref tracker query.
Yeah, that's true. Put in a ref tracker
The third
query.
question is, who owned the railway stations on the private railway? Were they government or were they owned by the private lines? In other words, did the EBR own the Renniston station?
That's an excellent question, and I'm afraid I just don't know the answer to that one. I imagine that if it was on private land, and then it would probably be owned privately. But I'm honestly, yeah, that's another question. I think we
We
might.
don't know whether private land or not, do we?
Yeah,
Because
no,
it might
okay.
be a lease or just a right of way.
True. Yep, that's true.
We never touched on any of that
No.
too much. Okay,
No.
thanks. Yep.
Yeah.
All right, more things to do.
Oh, you've got a whole day's worth, I think. Just at the back there.
During World War II, when the railways was producing weapons, where would we find information about that?
I have a feeling that might be National Archives stuff, because that would have been a federally directed initiative. Even though they use places like Inveresk rail yards, so there will be some crossover there in the use of the facilities, but that would most certainly be federal.
Which are upstairs in the history room. You can find National Archives on a Wednesday, Thursday and Friday. So they love to have people come up and ask questions. That's the gentleman.
Thanks for that, Alicia. You mentioned a few of the railway accidents are in TC10. Aside from things like coroner's files, would there be sites that would have reports on train accidents?
I think it really depended on what sort of accident. So there would have been a really big investigation if it was a signal failure or many people would have been involved in investigating it, not just the police but then also the companies themselves. Yeah, the coroner's reports often provide a really good overview of an accident. There are other files that were produced on accidents specifically in the railways department. So I'm thinking that I know that upstairs there's a whole series of photographs from derailments and things like that. I'm not quite sure exactly what number that is within the series, but there certainly is. If you were to have a look on our website under using the accidents or perhaps derailments, I think quite a few things will actually come up for you. We have photographs, as I said, but there's also various reports, because obviously when an accident happens, we need to make sure that it's not going to happen again. So there's always a thorough investigation. That information is certainly there. I have to say though that some of it may well be restricted because if it's a more recent accident, then that information is simply not available. It'll be older accidents for sure. Yeah. Yes.
I've got a copy of the Gazette, and my grandfather had that he was, in 1903, he'd been employed 3 years, and he was at the Zayan railway station. Would that assume it was government then?
Yeah.
That, whatever that line was.
Yeah.
Because they were all different lines, built by lines and all sorts of things.
Absolutely, and the area around Queenstown, I find the railway down there incredibly hard to understand because some of it was private with mining and some of it was government, and then it was Emu Bay and it was extended out, and then this joined with that and extended.
So the Zayan station, the fact that it's in the government Gazette,
yeah,
I would assume
that was
a part of the government.
Yeah,
and it might have been Zayan to Strong, was it?
Yeah, it was a government station that was used by EVR. The EVR terminated there and it went to the government to Strong.
And in 1903, I've also got my grandmother's record as well. My great-grandmother's record, and she'd been in service 26 years.
Yeah, wow.
In 1903. I believe that they were at the Exton railway station, the family.
Right.
And then the husband died in 93, and she was then transferred to Newstead or St Leonard's station.
Yes.
And was a gatekeeper there for
right.
many years.
Oh, that's really lovely. Yeah, it's a lovely railway family history. Yeah. Well, look, we might leave it there. So please do have a look at the display. We've put on a really lovely display actually in the Colonial Gallery there for you.
And I just want to, while we've got everyone has to go, to thank you very much.
No worries.
And thank our